Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jason Silva from William Patterson University's Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. And today I'm going to be talking about my research examining global mass shootings, comparing the United States against developed and developing countries. So let's get right into it. Mass shootings are deeply ingrained in American culture and psyche and have become as American as apple pie. They are deeply concerning to the American public because perpetrators target seemingly random victims in public locations. As a result, extensive political discourse, law enforcement training, and proposed legislation has been directed towards preventing mass shootings in America. However, some of the deadliest mass shootings in the last decade have occurred in other countries around the world, including New Zealand, Crimea, and Norway. Despite this, there is limited research examining global mass shootings, and in particular, what makes America unique. Studies that do examine global mass shootings are often limited by small sample sizes, a focus on a single type of mass shootings, such as school shootings, and examinations of only a few countries. Before 2019, only 3 studies had provided large-scale comparisons of mass shootings in the US and other countries. These studies find that US mass shootings are more likely than all global mass shootings to involve school locations, workplace locations, and multiple guns. Additionally, these studies find that firearm availability contributes to a higher rate of US mass shootings than other developed countries, as well as all other countries around the world. Of these 3 studies, Langford garnered national media attention after finding that despite having less than 5% of the global population, the US made up 31% of global mass shootings. However, this finding incited scholarly disagreement between Langford and John Lott, who both published numerous studies in Econ Journal Watch discussing their divergent findings rooted in definitional disagreements. This debate reflects a general issue in mass shooting research that minor definitional differences can drastically change and potentially skew understanding of the phenomenon. The drastic differences in current global mass shooting studies were largely rooted in 2 interconnected definitional criteria surrounding instances perpetrated by lone wolf actors and involving terrorist organizations. Studies of US mass shootings find most perpetrators act alone, and as such, Langford's examination of global mass shootings predominantly included single perpetrator shootings with only a few instances of dyad attacks involving 2 offenders. While Lott also finds the US almost exclusively includes single perpetrator incidents, they suggest 93% of mass shootings outside the US involve more than one shooter, with an average of 22 perpetrators and a median of 4 perpetrators per incident. Lott and Moody also break from US-centric definitions by including organized terrorism and, in some instances, battles over sovereignty. In other words, Lott is finding that developing countries have higher rates of organized terrorism instances involving guns. However, current research has yet to examine distinctions between developed and developing countries after removing organized terrorism instances or battles over sovereignty. As such, the current study offers further clarity on the global mass shooting debate and addresses previously unexplored areas of inquiry. Specifically, this study provides a comparative analysis of mass shootings in the US and other countries around the world between 1998 and 2019. 3 research questions are asked, including what are the differences in characteristics between US mass shootings and other developed countries, what are the differences in characteristics between US mass shootings in developing countries, and how do the number of mass shooting incidents and fatalities in the US compare to other developed countries. Given the definitional dispute, it's important to highlight the mass shooting definition used in this study. This study defines a mass shooting as a gun violence incident carried out in one or more public or populated locations within a 24-hour period involving at least some victims chosen at random and/or for their symbolic value. In other words, this study is looking at what is sometimes referred to as mass public shootings. This study took a conservative approach to characterizing the phenomenon using the 4 or more deaths criteria. This is because it is often difficult to identify instances involving less than 4 deaths around the world, and this helped ensure the integrity of the data. This study excludes profit-driven criminal activity, state-sponsored violence, or instances of familicide. In other words, this study excludes familicide and felony-related mass shootings as have been identified in previous studies. This study also excludes organized terrorism and battles over sovereignty. This was done for 2 reasons. First, Langford suggests that including organized terrorism and battles over sovereignty would be like comparing apples and oranges, since in the United States, these types of things do not occur. Additionally, when including these things, Lott's study finds that mass shootings primarily occur in developing countries and are rooted in these two issues. As such, removing them provides a new and previously unexplored understanding of the phenomenon. To identify global mass shootings, this study began with the Langford and Lott data that has been made publicly available. 50 news sources were also identified in Kaplan and Gomez's article. However, these sources primarily include United States mass shooting. As such, 21 news sources were identified by using keywords in 4 search engines to identify global mass shootings, not just instances in the United States. In the end, this study identified 272 global mass shootings between 1998 and 2019. 101 instances were in the United States and 171 were in other countries, including 35 in developed countries and 136 in developing countries. To analyze the 3 research questions, chi-square and t-test analyses were used to provide bivariate analysis. A logistic regression was then used to combining all variables to determine which variables provided the greatest impact. Additionally, the number and per capita rate of incidences and fatalities were used to examine all mass shootings in developed countries, including the United States. The characteristic variables that are examined include the perpetrator, motive, location, firearm, and conclusion. When looking at all mass shootings around the world, we find that the overwhelming majority of perpetrators are male. They are an average age of 33 years old, and 32% of global mass shooters had a military history, while 7% had a law enforcement history. The majority of perpetrators act alone, however, 3% involve dyad instances of 2 perpetrators. This is again because we excluded instances of organized terrorism or battles over sovereignty. When looking at motives, we find that 39% had victim-specific motives, meaning they targeted a specific individual that they knew, and then they ultimately went on to target other individuals at random. Other motives include financial problems as well as relationship problems, as well as fame-seeking and ideological motives. Fame-seeking referring to individuals attempting to garner personal fame or notoriety, and ideological referring to perpetrators attempting to garner notoriety or national attention to their terroristic or ideological beliefs. When looking at specific attack locations, we see that instances primarily occurred in military and police locations, as well as workplace, school, and to a lesser extent, religious and government locations. 23% of instances occurred outside and did not have a specific target in mind, and 24% of instances occurred in more than one distinct location. Rifles were the primary firearm used, followed by handguns and to a lesser extent shotguns, and 34% of instances involved multiple guns. In the end, the majority of perpetrators died, with 22% being killed and 35% committing suicide. Alternatively, 42% of perpetrators survived. Additionally, there was an average of 8 fatalities per instance and an average of 9 injuries per instance. Now, when considering the first research question comparing the United States against developed countries, the bivariate analyses find that military history, relationship problems, and instances occurring in the workplace were much more likely to occur in the United States. Alternatively, instances occurring outside and spree shootings involving more than one location were more likely to occur in other developed countries. The multivariate analysis finds that workplace shootings and multiple guns were more likely in the United States, and instances involving older perpetrators and those with ideological motivations, as well as spree shootings and instances involving the perpetrator's suicide, were more likely in developed countries. The second research question considers distinctions between the United States and other developing countries. And here we can see that there are many greater differences between the United States and developing countries than there were between the United States and other developed countries. Specifically, the United States was more likely than other developing countries to include financial problems, relationship problems, fame-seeking motives, ideological motives, school and workplace locations, handguns and shotguns, as well as multiple guns, and offender suicide. Alternatively, mass shootings in other developing countries were more likely than the United States to have a military history and law enforcement history, as well as involve a military or police location, a rifle, and the offender's survival. Finally, this work considers the number and proportion of mass shooting incidents in developed countries. Of the 36 developed countries identified by the UN, half did not have a single mass shooting between 1998 and 2019, and only 10 developed countries had more than one mass shooting. With 101 shootings, the U.S. had more than 12 times as many mass shootings as the country with the second highest mass shooting count. However, the U.S. had a substantially larger population than other developed countries, and as such, it's necessary to consider how U.S. instances rank proportionally. The U.S. ranks third highest of the developed countries with the most mass shooting incidents. Finland and Lithuania had the highest proportion of mass shooting incidents by population. However, when considering the previous figure, Finland only had 3 instances in a short period of time between 2007 and 2009, and Lithuania only had 1 in 1998. In other words, these countries have very small populations, and as such, the use of proportional examinations inflates the problem in these countries. Taken together, the U.S. made up 33% of the population of developed countries, but 73% of mass shootings. Finally, this work examined the number of fatalities as well as the proportion of fatalities. Here we see the United States had the greatest number of mass shooting fatalities, with 816 people killed between 1998 and 2019. Importantly, only 5 other developed countries had more than 20 fatalities, including France, Norway, New Zealand, Germany, and Finland. When looking at the proportion of developed countries' fatalities, we see that the U.S. ranks 6th highest of the developed countries with the most mass shooting fatalities. However, again, a closer examination finds that 3 of the highest fatality countries, Norway, New Zealand, and Lithuania, only had a single incident. Additionally, like the examination of the incident proportions, Lithuania and Finland had low fatality counts, but were skewed higher because of the small country populations. Taken together, the U.S. makes up 33% of the population of developed countries, but 62% of the mass shooting fatalities. So let's bring it all home. In general, this study finds that the U.S. made up 33% of the population of developed countries, but 73% of mass shooting instances and 62% of fatalities. Importantly, mass shootings in the United States were more likely to involve workplace instances, financial and relationship problems, and multiple guns. When looking at all developed countries, including the United States, we see that ideological and fame-seeking motivations, as well as school locations, handguns, and shotguns, were more likely than other developing countries. When excluding the United States, we see that other developed countries have higher rates of outside and spree attacks. Additionally, we find that developing countries were more likely than the United States to have perpetrators with a military or police history, to involve rifles, and to involve military and police locations. The implications of this research suggest that security measures should focus on target hardening in high-risk workplaces in the United States, modeling other location-based intervention strategies that have decreased incidents and casualties. Additionally, financial and relationship problems present American-specific strains and suggest warning signs for threat assessment when determining at-risk individuals accelerating towards violent action. Finally, in line with previous scholarship, multiple guns are likely contributing to higher rates of incidences and casualties in the United States. Despite the contentious nature of gun control, it's important to recognize that legislative inaction will likely ensure the continuation of this uniquely American phenomenon. When looking at all developed countries, including the United States, there's a higher rate of ideological and fame-seeking perpetrators, which suggests that media outlets should avoid sensational coverage that glorifies perpetrators and offers them a platform for disseminating information. Ideological perpetrators in this study are specifically focused on lone wolf terrorist shooters, and policies should focus on this specific type of terrorist threat for prevention in developed countries. Despite being more common than developing countries, school shootings were one of the least common locations in developed countries. Schools have been one of the most effective locations for foiling mass shootings, and intervention strategies should consider using similar methods for the more common workplace shootings in the United States. Developed countries outside the U.S. were more likely to involve outside and spree shootings. These interconnected variables suggest law enforcement is less prepared for handling mass shootings, likely in part because they are less common. The paradigm shift in U.S. law enforcement response in the aftermath of Columbine present lessons. This new paradigm focuses on rapid responses to engage, isolate, and neutralize the offender as quickly as possible and to decrease the number of casualties. Finally, when considering developing implications, as noted, studies have highlighted the higher rates of terrorism in general. However, when removing organized terrorist incidents, we find a previously unknown mass shooting problem in developing countries, and these involve military and police officials targeting military and police locations, in essence, acts of workplace violence. This suggests policies should consider the role of hazing and gun availability. Specifically, this study finds that many of the military and police officials were involved with hazing, which may have contributed to them targeting people in the workplace or their military and police locations. Additionally, many of these countries have much stricter gun control policies, and as such, the increase in military and police officials is likely due to gun availability, which is contributing to this specific mass shooting problem in developing countries. And thus concludes this presentation. I hope you found it insightful for understanding the global mass shooting problem as well as what makes America unique.